May 10th, 1945. The gray Norwegian dawn hung low over the sharp black cliffs of Holsenoy as U-977 rocked gently an anchor, its steel plates cold with the last breath of a dying winter. The war in Europe had ended only 2 days earlier, yet aboard the submarine the air was thick with a silence more suffocating than any depth charge. In the conning tower, Oberleutnant Heinz Schaeffer, only 24 years old and already carrying the weight of a collapsing nation on his narrow shoulders, watched his crew gather below with hollow, sleepless eyes. The boat smelled of old diesel, damp wool, and the stale breath of men who had lived too long in confined spaces. The radio message announcing Germany's unconditional surrender still echoed in their minds like a verdict. Service immediately. Cease all combat activity. Proceed to the nearest Allied port. Surrender your vessel. Schaeffer had repeated the message slowly, reading it aloud in the cramped control room, the pale bulb above his head flickering as if the electricity itself were refusing to accept what had happened. The young sailors stood motionless. Some clenched their jaws, others looked at the deck, afraid to meet one another's eyes. The 19-year-old torpedo man whispered a single word, Gefangenschaft, and the word spread through the boat like a chill. Captivity. The kind they all feared, the kind their fathers had warned them about after 1918, the kind the propaganda broadcasts had painted with images of sterilization, forced labor, humiliation, and the slow erasure of everything German. Schaeffer closed the logbook and spoke quietly, almost solemnly, telling them that the ocean offered one final choice: obey Donitz's orders and hand themselves over, or try something nearly unthinkable: run. Run into the Atlantic, run past the Allied patrols, run south to a land that had declared war in name only: Argentina. A risky hope, but a hope nonetheless. The control room filled with murmurs, doubt and adrenaline churning together. Some men demanded surrender, others begged for escape. And then the decision fell not from orders, but from hearts. 16 married men, pale and trembling, asked to be set ashore to return to families they might never see again. 32 others, mostly boys who had nothing waiting for them but ruins and silence, chose the Atlantic. At 06:15, with the sea breathing softly against the hull, Schaeffer stood on the conning tower and watched the 16 climb into rubber dinghies drifting toward the mist-covered rocks of Holsenoy. He knew that the next time he saw land it might be as a prisoner, if he saw land at all. Behind him, the hatch clanged shut. Diesel engines rumbled awake, vibrating through the steel like a heartbeat preparing for something forbidden. U-977 began to move, turning her bow toward the open water, and as the morning fog swallowed the shoreline, the 32 remaining men suddenly understood. Their world was no longer Germany, nor the Kriegsmarine, nor the war that had just ended. Their world was now the darkness beneath the Atlantic, and what waited for them there had only begun to reveal itself. The gray Norwegian coastline disappeared behind them like a fading memory as U-977 slipped beneath the surface, descending into the cold May waters at snorkel depth. Heinz Schaeffer stood in the control room, his hands resting lightly on the edges of the chart table as the submarine leveled out at 40 feet. The boat vibrated with a low metallic hum, a reminder of the engines straining behind steel walls already bruised from years of collisions and rushed wartime repairs. The fluorescent bulbs flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cramped space where 32 men braced themselves against the familiar, suffocating confinement of the deep. They were now fugitives in a war that had already ended, ghosts dragging themselves into a darkness that felt thicker and heavier than anything Schaeffer had experienced during his earlier patrols. Within hours, the first warning signs appeared. The snorkel float valve, an invention the crew barely trusted even on calm days, began to chatter violently each time a wave rolled over the pipe sticking out above the surface. Every time it sealed shut, the diesel engines choked, sucking the air straight from the boat's lungs. The pressure inside the hull dropped so quickly that men clutched their ears and bent over, gasping as if invisible hands were tightening around their throats. The youngest sailor, a boy from Munich, who had never spent more than 10 days at sea, collapsed against the bulkhead, pale and trembling. Schaeffer forced the engines to idle, but even at reduced speed, the air inside the submarine felt thin, stale, tinged with diesel fumes that burned the throat.
They could not risk surfacing. Any Allied aircraft patrolling the northern sea lanes would see them instantly. So the men endured, breathing the heavy air in silence while the boat crept westward like a wounded animal trying not to be noticed. By the second day, the strain settled into their bones. Condensation dripped from the ceiling constantly. Socks never dried. Clothing stuck to skin. Each time the snorkel slammed shut again, the diesels groaned, coughing clouds of oily smoke into the already poisoned atmosphere. The chief engineer, a quiet man named Mueller, whose hands seemed permanently stained with oil, climbed twice into the narrow snorkel housing to free the float valve. Each time he returned, drenched, shaking, eyes burning from the fumes, but he nodded to Schaeffer that the boat could continue. He did not mention that the rubber seals were beginning to crack under the constant pressure. He didn't need to. Everyone could hear the unnatural whistle in the air ducts each time the engines pulled too hard. As the Atlantic opened before them, the first mechanical failures began to surface. A pump jammed, a battery temperature gauge flickered and died. Condensation collected so heavily in the radio compartment that sparks snapped across the wiring. The boat felt old, tired, resentful of being dragged into another impossible journey. Each sound, the groan of the hull, the distant churn of unseen propellers overhead, the rhythmic thump of water against steel, felt amplified in the oppressive underwater twilight. Even the petty officers, hardened by years at sea, moved with uneasy glances, as if expecting at any moment the hull to split or the periscope to catch the silhouette of a destroyer bearing down on them. Late on the third night, as the submarine crawled westward at barely 6 knots, the hydrophone operator stiffened in his seat. Through the faint static, he heard something unmistakable: fast-turning propellers approaching from the northeast. Schaeffer ordered all hands to silent running. The diesels cut, plunging the boat into a sudden, breathless hush. The electric motors engaged with a soft rumble, and the lights dimmed as the batteries took the load. The crew froze, sweat gathering at their temples, listening. The propellers grew louder. The water around them trembled. Somewhere above, something large was moving directly across their path, and Schaeffer knew that if it detected them now, their escape would end before it had even begun.
By the fourth week, U-977 no longer felt like a submarine, but a damp, groaning chamber where the air itself had turned hostile. The deeper they pushed into the Atlantic, the farther they drifted from anything resembling normal life, and the submarine began to close around the men like a fist. Heinz Schaeffer moved through the narrow corridors with a quiet heaviness, listening to the unnatural symphony of the boat, the rattling of loose bolts, the slow hiss of damp insulation. The uneven rhythm of the electric motors strained far beyond their intended duty. The tropical waters were warming around them now, pressing their heat through the metal skin of the submarine until the interior turned into a suffocating oven. The temperature climbed past 35 degrees, then 40, and the stale air thickened with sweat and the sour scent of mildew. In the forward bunks, sailors lay motionless, half-conscious, their bodies salted with crystals formed from dried perspiration. The slow rot of everything inside the hull became impossible to escape. Mattresses grew patches of black fungus, wet uniforms clung permanently to skin, condensation dripped from the ceiling like a steady, maddening rain, turning every surface slick and cold. The electricians battled short circuits that sparked unpredictably in the control room. The medic moved constantly between hammocks, tending to blistered skin, infected cuts, red-eyed exhaustion, and stomach cramps caused by the monotony of canned food and warm metallic-tasting water. He had long since run out of proper antiseptics and had begun using engine grease to treat infections, his hands shaking each time he smeared the black substance over a wound. Even the steel seemed to change. The hull creaked under the pressure of warm currents, expanding and contracting with unsettling groans that sounded almost vocal, like something alive and suffering. At night, when Schaeffer walked the length of the control room, he would hear whispers from bunks, men imagining leaks, hearing phantom drips, convinced the sea was pressing inward. One young sailor, barely 17, began waking up screaming that he heard water bubbling inside the walls. Another, a mechanic from Hamburg, stopped speaking altogether, moving through the boat with wide, vacant eyes that saw nothing and everything at once. Discipline, once automatic and crisp, had started to erode. Watches were missed. Orders needed repeating. The faintest argument could turn into a burst of shouting before collapsing into exhausted apologies. The constant snorkel torture, those violent moments when the float valves slammed shut and the engines robbed the submarine of air, pushed even the strongest men to clutch their throats and fall to their knees. Each time the internal pressure dropped, ears ruptured, headaches flared, and panic rippled across the crew like a sudden sickness. Schaeffer could feel morale slipping through his fingers like sand. He tried to maintain order with calm, steady instructions, but the weight of command grew heavier each day, pressing into his shoulders as relentlessly as the humidity pressed into the steel. By mid-June, 40 days at sea, the psychological collapse deepened. The engineer reported that battery water levels were dropping too quickly. Sweat dripped from the walls above the battery cells, threatening to cause a catastrophic short circuit. The ventilation system moaned in protest with every turn of the fan. And still the boat pushed southward, deeper into waters where heat smothered all hope of relief. One evening, as the submarine lurched through a pocket of warm current, Schaeffer passed the torpedo room and saw a sailor curled in a hammock, whispering to himself, counting rivets in the ceiling again and again in a frantic loop that no one could interrupt. Another man had stopped eating, claiming that the food was poisoned by the boat itself. The medic warned Schaeffer that he was beginning to lose control of them. The turning point came without warning. During an unbearably hot dawn, as the submarine rocked gently at snorkel depth, a sudden alarm tore through the control room. The remaining diesel engine, a machine that had become their only lifeline, began to sputter violently, coughing clouds of black smoke that filled the engine room with choking fumes. Schaeffer sprinted toward the compartment, his boots slipping on the metal floor, the scent of oil stinging his eyes. Mueller stood over the engine, face streaked with sweat and soot, shouting that cooling water was no longer circulating. Something had clogged the intake. Schaeffer froze for a single heartbeat. If the engine stopped completely now, the boat would suffocate. The batteries were nearly spent. The heat was unbearable. The men were on the edge of collapse. The submarine could not survive another hour without power. And then, Mueller looked up at him, with a face drained of color. "Herr Oberleutnant, someone will have to go outside."
The equatorial waters swallowed U-977 in a suffocating embrace, turning the submarine into a drifting furnace where air, heat, and fear fused into a single oppressive mass. By late June, when the boat crossed into the tropics, the temperature inside the hull climbed so high that metal fixtures were painful to touch. The engine room reached unimaginable levels, 45, then 50 degrees, while the living compartments hovered just below, thick with humidity so dense that men's lungs felt as though they were breathing through wet cloth. Heinz Schaeffer moved through the narrow passageways with a steady, determined stride, but even he felt the crushing weight of exhaustion settling into his bones. Sweat soaked through his uniform from morning to night, and the stale atmosphere tasted of rust, diesel, and human despair. Every breath carried the sour reminder that the submarine was no longer a machine, but a slow, sweating organism on the edge of collapse. The crisis with the cooling intake came like a death sentence. The remaining diesel engine, the only engine keeping the boat moving through the Atlantic, began to shudder violently, coughing out thick clouds of smoke that turned the engine room into a blinding haze. Mueller, the chief engineer, knelt beside the churning machinery, his face streaked with soot, shouting over the roar that the cooling water was no longer circulating. Something had clogged the intake from outside. It could be seaweed, barnacles, drifting debris, but whatever it was choking the engine to death. Without that engine, the submarine would suffocate within hours. The batteries were nearly depleted. The snorkel was failing more frequently with each passing day.
The men were too weak to endure another deep dive on electric motors alone. Schaeffer stared at the machinery, the trembling pipes, the flickering gauges. The air was so hot it rattled in his throat. He knew the choice before him was nearly impossible. No manual guideline, no Kriegsmarine order had ever prepared a commander for this. Someone had to exit the submarine while submerged, entering the crushing dark water to clear the intake grill by hand. It was madness. No one had ever attempted such an operation in these conditions, but Mueller, sweat dripping from his chin like falling beads of molten metal, volunteered without hesitation. He spoke with a calmness that unsettled everyone around him, as if the heat and exhaustion had burned away the instinct for self-preservation. The escape chamber flooded slowly, each liter of water rising like a cold verdict around Mueller's chest. He clung to the handrails, trembling, his breathing loud inside the chamber. When the outer hatch finally opened, the warm Atlantic water surged in, swallowing him into its murky blue. Inside the submarine, men waited in suffocating silence, their ears pressed against the cold steel, listening for anything, scraping, tapping, a signal. Mueller worked blindly, clinging to the hull, using a steel rod to break apart clumps of seaweed clogging the intake grill. With every movement, his breath dwindled. Twice he returned to the escape chamber gasping, only to go out again the moment the hatch sealed behind him. On the fourth attempt, his body failed him. He slipped, nearly lost his grip, swallowed warm seawater, and drifted for a terrifying seconds before clawing his way back to the hull. When the crew finally pulled him through the escape chamber hatch, he was unconscious, his lips blue, his lungs heaving like bellows. The medic worked over him frantically, pounding his chest, forcing air back into his fragile frame until Mueller finally coughed and gasped awake. But the intake was cleared, the engine stabilized, the boat lived. Yet the victory tasted hollow. Days later, the worst heat of the voyage descended upon them. Inside the submarine, men lay half delirious, whispering nonsense, some hallucinating voices inside the hull. The medic warned Schaeffer that 2 men were nearing heat stroke so severe that their organs might fail. And still U-977 pushed southward, the ocean outside shimmering with heat, the interior shaking with the uneven rhythm of their dying endurance. Then, on July 14th, after 66 days of this submerged torment, the heat reached a point no human body could endure. Schaeffer knew that remaining underwater meant death. And so, breaking every rule of submarine warfare, he made a decision that could destroy them all. At midday, with the Atlantic shining like molten glass, he ordered the submarine to surface. And what awaited them on the blazing horizon was something none of them had expected to see again.
The ocean looked almost unreal when U-977 broke the surface that scorching afternoon, as if the Atlantic itself had been hammered into a plate of blinding silver. The crew staggered up the ladder in small groups, shielding their eyes against the brutal sunlight. For the first time in 66 days, they felt real wind on their faces. A hot, dry wind, but a wind nonetheless, and the shock of fresh air hit them so violently that several men collapsed to their knees, laughing and crying through cracked lips. Heinz Schaeffer stood on the conning tower, blinking hard as if waking from a fever dream. The sea stretched endlessly around them, shimmering under the crushing weight of the equator's sun. For a few moments, they were not fugitives. They were simply men who had survived. Bodies thin as shadows moved across the deck with slow, trembling steps. Some sailors leaned against the warm steel, letting the sunlight bake their skin after months of darkness. Others cupped their hands to the sky, catching drops of sweat and seawater running down their faces. The youngest stood at the rail, staring out at the horizon as though it were a doorway to another life. Yet beneath the brief moment of relief, another reality pulsed like a dark vein beneath the surface. Fuel. The engineers' calculations were dire. The solitary diesel engine was consuming more than expected, weakened by the weeks of heat stress and forced operation. What remained would barely carry them to Cape Verde, let alone the full expanse of ocean to Argentina. Their voyage had shifted from endurance to mathematics, numbers, tank levels, and the cold, merciless truth that one error, one storm, one prolonged dive could cost them the last drops of fuel and leave them drifting helplessly toward death. By evening, the submarine anchored off the barren rocks of Bronco Island. The crew swam in the warm water like ghosts freed from chains, their gaunt bodies cutting through the waves in long, slow strokes. Laughter echoed across the silent island cliffs, thin, hysterical laughter that spoke not of joy, but of relief so intense it bordered on madness. When they climbed back aboard, their limbs shook from exertion, but their eyes held something almost alive again. Schaeffer watched them from the tower, knowing that this moment of reprieve would be short-lived. Already the sun was dipping low, and the ocean's color was shifting to deeper tones, warning him to submerge before the night sky betrayed them to any distant patrol aircraft. Once the hatch sealed again, the submarine returned to its familiar darkness. But now the heat inside felt different, not the suffocating equatorial choke of the past weeks, but something more tolerable. The ocean around them was cooling slightly as they moved farther south. Men breathed easier, their minds steadied. Yet the danger had not retreated. It had simply changed shape. Fuel became their new tormentor. Every hour the engine ran was a silent gamble against the ocean itself. Schaeffer ordered the speed reduced to 3 knots, barely enough to maintain forward motion. The submarine rocked sluggishly in the swells like an exhausted animal, the engine beating a tired rhythm that echoed through the hull. By the end of July, with the South American coastline still far beyond the curve of the horizon, the crew's anxiety returned, not born of heat or darkness this time, but of the quiet pulse of the fuel gauge. The needle trembled dangerously close to the red. Muller devised a desperate method to siphon the last traces from auxiliary tanks, tapping the reserves with makeshift pumps pieced together from hose clamps and scavenged piping. Every drop mattered. Every liter was a day of life or death. Men handled fuel like treasure, carrying buckets with shaking hands, as though they held their own beating hearts. On August 10th, Muller approached Schaeffer with a pale face and trembling jaw. Less than 2 tons of fuel remained. 3, 4 days. If they missed the river mouth by even a few kilometers, if currents pushed them off course, if the weather turned, they would drift into the South Atlantic with no power, no hope, and no way to call for help. Schaeffer absorbed the information with a calmness that masked the tightening in his chest. He gave the only order he could: hold course, reduce speed yet again, and pray that the ocean allowed them passage. By August 15th, just before dawn, a faint line appeared on the horizon, soft, pale, almost invisible through the haze. Land. The first land they had seen in more than 3 months. Men rushed to the periscope like children, weeping openly as the Argentine coast took shape, fragile and distant, but unmistakably real. Yet the engine sputtered, choking on fumes. They had almost nothing left. Every turn of the propeller was borrowed time. And as the sun rose behind them, casting long shadows across the still water, Schaeffer realized that reaching the shore would not be their end. Something else awaited them there. Something the crew was not prepared to face. Because the world had not forgotten about German submarines suddenly appearing in distant harbors.
The morning of August 17, 1945, rose pale and cold over the Rio de la Plata, a strange contrast to the brutal heat U-977 had endured for months. The estuary spread out before them like a vast sheet of gray glass, its waters heavy with mud and the distant smell of land, real land, close enough that even the exhausted men could sense it before they saw it.
Heinz Schaeffer stood rigid at the conning tower as the submarine crawled toward the harbor of Mar del Plata, the engine coughing like an old man breathing his last. 32 men lined the interior, silent, gaunt, hollow-eyed, their uniforms clinging to skeletal frames. They were barely recognizable as sailors now, more like shadows wearing rags, remnants of a crew held together by will instead of strength. When the Argentine patrol vessel approached, its gray hull emerging from the morning haze, the crew of U-977 instinctively stiffened. For a moment, the silence inside the submarine grew so profound that even the soft vibrations of the dying engine felt louder. The patrol boat slowed alongside them, and Argentine sailors stared at what stepped onto the deck. Figures with sunken faces, cracked lips, hollow cheeks, and bones visible beneath translucent skin. Schaeffer saluted, though his hand trembled violently, and presented himself with the formality of a man who had survived something no protocol had ever anticipated. The Argentine officer who climbed aboard paused mid-step, stunned, the expression on his face shifting from suspicion to disbelief as he saw the state of the crew. These were not warriors of a hidden Reich. These were survivors of a descent into darkness. Once ashore, the crew was taken into custody, not as prisoners of war, nor as criminals, but as men who carried a mystery too large to ignore. Rumors spread through Argentina within hours. Newspapers printed words like secret mission, Hitler's escape, Nazi treasure. The timing was irresistible. A German submarine arriving 3 months after the war's end, appearing unannounced in a country famous for its sympathy towards German expatriates. Crowds formed outside the naval barracks. Some pointed, some muttered accusations, others stared with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination, as though expecting a ghost of the Führer to step out from behind the gaunt sailors. Schaeffer quickly realized that the danger was far from over. The Americans arrived within a week, sharp-eyed intelligence officers who carried thick files and spoke in clipped tones. They divided the crew, interrogating each man separately in cold rooms that smelled of ink and stale coffee. They wanted numbers, dates, positions, explanations. Why they had not obeyed the surrender order, why they had surfaced where they did, whether they had landed passengers along the way. Each sailor answered with the same story. They had fled, and nothing more. The Americans did not believe it at first. They mapped the submarine's fuel consumption, analyzed every entry in the logbook, and questioned Muller for hours about engine conditions, battery charge cycles, and snorkel operations. Slowly, the truth emerged, not a story of conspiracy, but of endurance. The fuel remaining in the tanks, less than 500 gallons, fit perfectly with a direct voyage across the Atlantic. The torpedo inventory matched the reports. None had been fired. The detached, exhausted manner of the crew could not be faked, not by men barely able to stand, their hair falling out from malnutrition, their skin peeling from humidity and salt. The Americans closed their files reluctantly, unable to refute what the evidence proved. U-977 had done nothing but run and survive. But outside the interrogation rooms, myths multiplied. In Buenos Aires cafes, men whispered that Hitler had fled ashore near Patagonia. Others claimed the submarine had carried gold, scientists, secret documents, anything the imagination could craft from shadows. The truth was too simple, too human, too mundane for a world hungry for secrets in the aftermath of catastrophe. Schaeffer understood this bitter irony as he watched reporters sketch his silhouette onto newspaper pads. The real story, the impossible voyage, the months of heat and terror, was being smothered beneath fantasies. When Schaeffer was eventually released, he looked back only once at the place where U-977 had been moored. The submarine had already begun its second, quieter death. Inspected, stripped, and prepared for towing to the United States. It would never return to the ocean that had nearly killed its crew. And as the sun dipped over the Argentine coast, casting long shadows across the harbor, Schaeffer realized something that would follow him for the rest of his life. The world would remember their submarine not for its suffering, but for the legends invented about it, a truth far heavier than any depth they had ever reached.